I'm going to talk about vision and neurobehavioural needs arising from deep midbrain injury, multisystem, rehabilitative, and educational support for every child. Thank you, Helen. That is the longest title I've ever had to talk to, chosen by Helen. I think you probably all recognize it, so I'm going to do my best. Thank you, Helen. I've been, as Darren has very kindly said, at Great Ormond Street for a long time. I've been there 30 years. I've had the privilege of meeting many children with brain tumours over the years and their families. And in particular, I've met children who've lost vision, who have visual impairment. And it is, for many children with a brain tumour, one of the first signs that something's going wrong is loss of vision. It's very traumatic, and it's actually that starts getting them on the road via ophthalmology, often into oncology through brain scans, that something is causing their vision. However, let's just make sure I can move my slides forward. There we go. There are particular tumours that are more associated with chronic, longer-term visual impairment. And it's been incredibly helpful to have Manuela's marvellous talk on hypothalamus, because the tumours that are particularly associated with visual impairment long-term are craniopharyngioma, optic glioma. Parents and young people do sometimes, I find, even years later, have said, I don't actually know why I've got visual impairment. And the next slide, I think, actually shows it a little bit better, because what actually is happening is the tumour is resting on the optic pathways, and the optic pathways are extraordinarily vulnerable. They go from the eye right through to the back of the head, the posterior, the visual cortex, and it's those frontal or anterior optic nerves that if a brain tumour is sitting on them, even if later the tumour is smaller and it's been treated and cured, unfortunately, we don't have reversible treatments for damage to the optic nerve. And that is actually what is often causing the visual impairment. So it's a very serious association of the tumour that we can't reverse. And I think my experience from many families is the visual impairment is actually a very serious disability to come to terms with for the child and for the family. The initial is that these are often children who were sighted in their early stage of their lives. And for some children, it's going to be total loss of vision. They're going to be fully blind. Some children, it's mild or moderate visual impairment. In some cases with these deep midbrain tumours, to do with treatment and the course of the tumour later, and I know that some children here and their families have gone through this, a child who's perhaps lived with partial vision and partial visual impairment for a number of years, quite a few years, is now faced with total loss of vision. It's actually got worse in some cases. In some cases, there's some improvement after treatment, but there is a very huge adjustment. And we're talking about psychology and psychiatry and well-being. One of the huge adjustments is actually adjusting to visual impairment, and it affects every aspect of the child's functioning, their everyday life, their learning, their cognition, their mobility, and their access to everyday activities and participation in society. And I'm struck when I read some of the stories, and we hear about the stories of young people who are in schools, in mainstream, or now some of them in more specialist schools. The issue when you've lost vision of how you keep up with your peer relationships is a very challenging one. You don't see them in the playground, you can't find them, you've been in hospital for long periods of treatment, and as this all compounds, you often become more isolated, added to by having the visual impairment. So this is going on potentially alongside all the other changes that Manuela has been talking about. And Manuela, you mentioned this study that's been done by quite a few of the colleagues here. I think it's an important one because when we're thinking about the impact of the visual impairment, and it's going on with these midline tumours, the craniopharyngioma, the optic gliomas, and some of the other pituitary adenomas. We are going to be also seeing potentially the impact of the hypothalamus on mood and behaviour, and neurobehavioural deficits. And I just want to share, I always think it's good when we come to these conferences to show that we're not only doing clinical work, but we're also trying to keep on with our understandings, because that helps us to do better interventions over time. That a group of us have just looked recently in our developmental vision service, which I'm part of at Great Ormond Street. It's part of our paediatric neurodisability service. So we see children, we're a multidisciplinary team, we see children with all aspects of visual impairment, a lot of children with eye disorders, but we see a lot of children with brain-based visual impairment as well, and also brain tumours. So we just look back on a related condition. It's not a tumour condition, it's congenital, called septo-optic dysplasia. But you also get this optic nerve hyperplasia. The optic nerve is damaged, and you have also hypothalamic dysfunction, the pituitary gland. So we looked at what 81 children who'd come to our clinic, mainly through neuroendocrinology in our own hospital, but also externally. And all of the children most of them had moderate to profound visual impairment. Over half had growth hormone deficiency, and about 25% had additional brain complex changes, complex SOD. So when you look at those children, they all came to us with concerns. It's interesting why they came to us. Sorry, I hope you're not getting a little bit of a back echo, but I apologize if you are. Might be I'm standing a bit too close. All of those children came to us with concerns, and these are very, very common, and they're very common for us around brain tumor as well. Concerns around behavior, social communication, and general concerns about cognition as well. Now, in the septo-optic dysplasia group, of those children of 81 between the age of 4 to 14 years, over half got a diagnosis of autism from our clinic, over half got a diagnosis of intellectual disability from our clinic, and over half got a diagnosis of externalizing behavior difficulties. Now, what do we mean by externalizing? They are very, very associated with hypothalamic difficulties. They are the difficulties where children have problems with what we call impulse control. They have a greater tendency towards impulsivity. They may have a greater tendency when they get frustrated to become more aggressive. Sometimes they're described as being more rule-breaking. But I think it's often children who don't respond well to stress. And from lay terms, or let's say parent terms, I'm also a parent, what we really call meltdowns. Children's tendencies to have a lot of meltdowns when they get frustrated. And that is quite common in my experience around the hypothalamic disorders. So what did we find in that study? Well, when you have to control for things, when you design a study like this to see what might be, when might you have a high risk of autism in just the septo-optic dysplasia, which is congenital. So in these children, when you have a more severe visual impairment, so at this end, wait a minute, there's my laser. At this end of the graph, this is going on higher up visual impairment, it's more serious. You can see the rate, the red boxes, the rate is going up with visual impairment. So the more severe your visual impairment, the greater the autism likelihood, even when you've controlled for growth hormone deficiency and complexity of brain change. We found the same with intellectual disability, but interestingly, we found something which was a bit unusual for us, that when are you most likely to have these externalizing behavior difficulties? It goes up 3 times more when you have a more simple SOD, so you've got nothing else except the pituitary gland problems and the optic nerve hyperplasia, than if you've got more complex brain changes. Now, that's a bit surprising. Usually we always think you get more behavior difficulties when you have greater complexity of brain changes. So we're again thinking this is highlighting that it's something very much linked to what we call the hypothalamic, is pituitary. This is where these craniopharyngioma and optic nerve glioma tumours are very close to. It's something around difficulties and the stress reactions. Manuela's been explaining that, emotional regulation and externalizing behavior problems. And Ashley, just to share that with you as a psychiatrist, it's a highly significant issue for the young person often and the family. A lot of the young people are extremely well behaved at school, as I'm sure parents who may have these young people will know, but when they come home, all these frustrations, the difficulties coping with the whole day, all comes out as often very externalizing behavior difficulties, and it can be very hard for everybody, the management of that. So what do we need to do? And Helen's asked me to come up with some solutions. Well, I know what we do all the time, so I can only share what we do as a team. And I think it is, and some key messages. I think loss of vision is a developmental and a psychological emergency. So the minute we've got that signs, even as treatments are starting, the child's now getting the very first brain tumour treatments, we need to be supporting the child and family with vision loss. It's a very major disability and it cannot be underestimated enough. And it's not just an add-on thing, it's a major change for the child. So we've got to be supporting the child's development and psychological well-being. My experience, because I see a lot of children with eye disorders and congenital visual impairment from other reasons, that the loss of vision has a lot of impact on a lot of learning. That's a complex process, but we need to support the child's development. And this is going on top of everything else they're going through medically. So there is a lot of adjustments, even from moving from vision as a primary source to more use of touch or hearing. And that is not as straightforward. It happens at both adaptation level psychologically, but it also has to happen at neurological level. So there's cognitive and learning issues. I'm going to let Charlotte, my colleague, say a lot more about the psychological aspects. I've kept away from them, you'll be pleased to know, Charlotte. But there's also the social development, and there's also autism risks. And we do believe that the hypothalamic disorder is itself contributing to greater tendencies to be a bit more obsessional, a bit more fixed in one's behavior, a bit more restricted in one's topics. And I've seen a lot of children where over time, and I've known them very well, we have all agreed, parents and ourselves as a multidisciplinary team, it's in the child's interest to add on the diagnosis of autism. And we're not saying that it's quite the same as like a core autism you were born with, but if you've developed it as part of this illness pathway, it's important it's understood if the child's needs are going to be met well locally. We do need to make sure that we don't miss the needs that each child has. And then there's the issue of behaviour and emotion regulation. And just on that, a key thing as we're thinking about what kind of inputs do we need, well, we have to have colleagues like myself, neurodisability paediatricians, neuropsychologists, occupational therapists, we all work together as a team, who can test for these children in a way that takes into account their visual impairment. And just sharing, we've just got it under review. One of the things we've just been doing as a clinic, we've been doing it scientifically, is how to modify the gold standard test, which is the autism, the ADOS, we call it, for assessing autism for children with visual impairment. So that's just hopefully soon in publication. But there are a lot of other areas, and this is where you start working, if you're in specialist teams, you start working closely with your community-based services. Children may have to start learning to read Braille. They may have been a font reader before, or suddenly they're having to read much larger font than they could read before. Or maybe they've never entered reading yet because they're a very young child, but they're going to have to learn to read in new ways. Some children, and I know I've met through this conference sometimes parents who say, actually my child's vision recovered, the acuity, but they've always been troubled by their vision, their visual perception. And that's an area that I'm personally very interested in as well. It's not just whether your acuity has recovered, but how is your visual perception? So those are related areas: navigation, mobility, peer and social relationships. And Manuela brought up coping with fatigue as you manage in the school environment, you've also got all these medical issues going on. So this is just the pyramid. Charlotte's going to say more about it, but my view of the pyramid is as and when needed, you need an assessment, multidisciplinary, but neuropsychology is a very key part of it, adapted for your visual impairment to identify your needs. And also, you may have additional learning needs. Those must not be missed. It can't all be blamed or put down to the visual impairment. We have to unpick exactly what's happening for the child. And stress and emotion and feeling low can often be a mismatch as well about the schools not meeting their needs well. So assessment-led rehabilitation that allows the program of rehabilitation to be led by the assessment. I'm not keen on assessments all the time, but I think when the child needs it, it's terribly important, working with school and home. So really the final thing, it's lost a few, something in my slide's gone. Who is brought into all of this? This is really the multisystemic things. I better get to the last bit, otherwise Helen will say you haven't answered the question. I'll try and get there. We've obviously got our specialist teams who have to work together. We've got ophthalmology, our neuroendocrinology and neuro-oncology, but ophthalmology is very important in all of this, our neuro-ophthalmologists. We do need our specialist pediatric neurodisability teams because we need teams who can actually do really good assessments with children who've got visual impairment and understand the brain tumour. So there are not many of us around yet, but I think across the country we should soon start having these different teams. And then you're working very, very closely with your community teams. You've got your specialist visual impairment teacher, the rehabilitation service, the SEN education, all the therapies. And I noticed, just reading before, some of the children, what they were sharing, the importance for them of art, crafts, hobbies, music. There's so many talents that children bring to bear who've got visual impairment and tumours, who've had tumours. We need to be able to support all those skills, the talents, blind sports, there are many different things, all the leisure activities, community, paediatrics, and the mental health team. And my final thing really is my feeling, if I really share, because I always like to put in a little bit of who I feel I am, on top of all of these inputs of expertises, I actually think most of all we have to all share the same principles of care. And those are that each child is different, individual, and as a person first, we need to understand them, their needs, their aspirations, and the individual family. Each family is different and each child is very different. But we need to have a developmental model that goes across the lifespan. We bring together the multi-professional knowledge and expertise as and when needed. It is multi-system rehabilitation and educational support, but we most of all do need to have a model that is able to translate itself into compassionate care, psychological well-being, and living well, however the child is and the family, so that all really thrive and prosper and flourish. So thank you very much.